have been trying to learn as much as I can about food preservation. There are so many reasons that I'm looking into this. Number one is the state of our world, our supply chains, our agriculture, and just the hot mess that we now live in. Obviously, I'm also concerned about the prices we're seeing, and being a person who predominantly eats gluten-free food, it means the prices are 4 times more expensive. So I've been working with these Mylar bags, but what I'm finding is quite strange is that with an adequate oxygen absorber, some bags just don't seal up the same way others do. And I know as long as they get smaller, they're good, but I still find it disturbing when it doesn't shrink down all the way, and when some don't really do anything at all and you can't find a hole in the bag or anything wrong with the bag, but it has still shrunken down a little bit. There are a couple of bags I'm going to keep watching to see if they get any better over time, but there are some that I'm just not sure that the oxygen absorber worked or that there's not a fault in the bag somewhere. I don't know if you guys find it difficult when these bags don't just seal perfectly, but I certainly do. Let me know in the comments. My mum had a dehydrator, but she never used it, so I adopted it. And we've had numerous announcements that our farmers have been walloped by all the floods that we've had in Australia's east coast this year, and that means that there's a massive shortage coming of fruit and veg. And so I thought I would start experimenting with the dehydrator, and I headed down to my local supermarket to pick up a stack of things to experiment with in terms of dehydrating, and also to blanch and freeze, particularly with things like spinach. I never seem to have enough spinach when I need it, and always seem to have too much when I buy it. So I thought I would buy a whole stack of it and freeze it into portion size amounts and see how that goes. I've never used frozen spinach before, but it's time to learn and experiment. We've been spoilt with fresh produce for so long. The first thing I ever dehydrated was meat snacks for the dog, and then it turned out he might be allergic to certain proteins, so they're all just sitting in my pantry. But what I discovered with that is that the trays have too large a hole to dehydrate most things. They shrink down way more than you think they will. So I ordered some covers online, and they needed to be trimmed down a little bit to make them fit. And even then, all the trays didn't have a cover. So I would imagine for most vegetables, when they're diced for dehydration, that they would fall through the holes. So I covered most of the trays in the silicone lining that I ordered online, and the others I just used baking paper. And I had about 4.5 kilos of frozen veg. So that's a bit over 2 pounds. It's about 2.2 kilos per pound, but my maths is always horrible. So I set up the dehydrator, and I ran out of baking paper and gave the inner tube to the dog because he loves to rip apart anything cardboardy. And it was one of those moments that I was so glad I have a stocked pantry, because it would have been so annoying to have to go back to the shops to get more baking paper. But I thought I'd start with the zucchini, and I spread them all out on the trays, and I went through and had a look for any funky looking brown bits or any that had like dirt or something else on them that would be undesirable to dry onto your zucchini. But I started loading it all into the dehydrator, and I was just thinking, like, I've never cooked with dehydrated food. This is going to be one big experiment. First, learning how to dehydrate and kind of seeing how long and how shelf stable these things are, and then learning how to cook with them and seeing what the flavor is like. I am aware that when you dehydrate, because it cooks the food a little bit, you do lose some of the nutritional value, and that's why I've been really looking into a freeze dryer. But with the Australian dollar doing so badly against the US dollar, they are currently about $8,500. So it's a fairly hefty investment. Pressure canning for preservation is something that I have looked into, and I recently ordered my own pressure canner, but I'm a little nervous to use it because I know you need to use specific recipes in order to maintain the right balance and not end up with food poisoning. But there are a lot of ingredients in some of those fixed recipes that I'm not a particular fan of, like jalapenos. So I need to do a lot more research, and I need to just get over it and try it as well. Raph is pretty keen. My pressure canner actually arrived while I was dealing with the aftermath of giving the puppy some boxes and setting up the other frozen veg for dehydration. So once it had arrived and I dealt with it, I just finished loading up the trays with an array of vegetables and popped them in the dehydrator. I started with zucchinis, green beans, and broccoli, and I just wanted to kind of experiment with how long they were going to take to dehydrate. I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube where people basically set their dehydrator for what seems like a really large number of hours, and then they just go to bed. Now, obviously, these are people who have dehydrated before rather than newbies like me, but my dehydrator doesn't have a timer, and I'm terrified I'm going to burn the house down. So I did it in the middle of the day where I could keep an eye on them, and I just tried to get my vegetables into small enough pieces where they would dehydrate regularly. And I did share some with the dog because if a vegetable is frozen or pureed, he thinks it's the best. If it comes in its natural form, unless it's a berry or a piece of fruit, he is not interested. So I just kept on going, kept stocking the dehydrator, and I would check it periodically and sometimes rotate the trays to make sure they got even dehydration. But it took a fair few hours because I wanted to make sure everything was nice and crispy. YouTube has definitely been my main teacher when it comes to dehydrating, and I basically understood that the food needed to be made as crispy as humanly possible. You needed to be able to snap it with your fingers to try and minimize the amount of moisture that is actually in the food that you're going to be preserving up. And so I just kept going until I could snap them, and for a long time they were just bendy. I was actually surprised how much faster it was to dehydrate the meat that I made for Rafa, but I guess the vegetables kind of had to defrost first in order to dehydrate. The nice thing about using frozen vegetables is that most of the time they are blanched prior to freezing, and that means they are good to go from a dehydration perspective. If I was just buying fresh veg from the local farmer's market, I would have had to blanch all of it first. Once I was finished with the beans, I went through and snapped every single one. I was super paranoid that for some reason they weren't done. And the interesting part about going through and snapping each one was I did find not whole beans that weren't done, but parts of beans that were done. And so I tossed them back in the dehydrator a number of times. Because the dehydrator kind of cooks as it dehydrates, I did have to remove some of the zucchini as I went because it was starting to get overdone. And as a learning process, to be honest, I took things out and put them back in a bunch of times. It took probably about 6 hours to do the whole lot and have them properly dried. From there, I just needed to pop them in jars so I could monitor them on the kitchen table for a week to make sure there wasn't any signs of moisture, which meant that I could move on to some of the garden harvest items like celery and carrots, and I could start to prepare them for freezing. I also picked up a bunch of carrots at Costco and some other fresh produce at the local supermarket. And blanching them just meant chopping them all up and popping them in steaming water for usually under 2 minutes, depending what it was. If it was the spinach, it was only in for a matter of seconds, and celery and carrots needed to be in there for a little bit longer. And then I was able to pop them into freezer bags, and I've been trying to find reusable freezer bags because to me it just seems like such a waste of money and such a bad thing for the environment to use the one-use ones. The only thing with the one-use ones is I do use them when I'm making things like soups and bolognese. I've found that that is the most effective way for me to store things in the freezer with one meal size portion without it staining everything. So while it's not ideal, I am still working on the best setup. I find that a lot of time the plastic takeaway boxes do crack and then your stuff gets freezer burn. So by the time I got everything ready and popped it all away in the resealable, reusable bags, I had spent quite a bit of time preparing and working on my food preservation, which is something I need to learn more about heading into spring and summer. I have a veggie patch in my current rental and I want to make the most of the produce that comes out of there and be able to keep as much of it as possible. So even though some of these are brown, that is how long I've had to dehydrate them, even though I cut them quite small, to actually get them to not feel a bit bendy when I tried to snap them, and therefore to try and get rid of all the moisture. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not really that worried about it. You're probably going to cook the broccoli anyway. You weren't going to rehydrate it and eat it raw. But the onion has turned out really, really well. Now I've just got to add the broccoli to the other dehydrated food that I made earlier, and then I'm done for the day. So this will have been a total of about, I think, 4.5, 5 kilos of frozen veg, and it doesn't turn into very much. So this is all of the stuff I did before. This is about 4 kilos of frozen veg. We've got zucchini, broccoli, and green beans, and it really doesn't equal very much. So if I want to get a bit more of a store, so I have more food security in my pantry, then I'm going to need to make up quite a bit more. But I only had a spare sort of 36 hours that I wasn't expecting to have, and I feel like I made the most of it by doing all this dehydrating and food prep. I was supposed to be in Sydney, but my mum has a cough and a slight upper respiratory tract infection, and I stay with my parents when I'm in Sydney, and I'm on immunosuppressants, so I don't want whatever she's got. So I've delayed my trip to Sydney, which has given me time to do all of this, but I've got a very long way to go. But this is a great first step, I think, in terms of long-term food preservation without being dependent on either a fridge or a freezer for preservation, and without being so dependent on my garden. Obviously, I would like to be dependent on my garden, but we've had 4 flood level rains in the first sort of 6 full months of the year. So, you know, the garden's looking a bit rough. The other thing I need to do is decide what I'm going to do about these Mylar bags. So this is medium grain rice, long grain rice, medium grain rice. I find really often when I use these larger Mylar bags, they don't seal up properly. And they have 500cc oxygen absorbers in them, so they should be fine. I did try and puff out as much air as I could before sealing it. But, like, I don't know. I mean, this one I think has lost a bit more air than this one. But it just never seems to work. And I mean, some of these bags that I got were a bit dodge. So maybe that's the problem. But I might have to crack them open and whack another oxygen absorber in, but that means I will have to pour some of the rice that was in here out, because I'll have to reseal along here. I find these little clip pressure zip tie thing, ziplock, whatever they're called, things on the Mylar bags are great, but also, like, sometimes I had a lot of trouble sealing these ones. So when you're trying to seal them in a hurry because you put the oxygen absorber in, it doesn't really help. And I find if you try and melt halfway along, 3/4 of the way along, closed first, and then whack the Mylar bag in, it's hard to get this closed still. So I don't know, maybe I'm better off just not getting the ones with the press close and just using the regular ones and just ironing them closed. If you guys have had the same trouble, let me know. But also let me know if you too are really paranoid about bags that haven't properly vacuum sealed. I know as long as they've gotten smaller, it should be right, but it's still like, it's a lot of food to waste if it's not right, and so it does make me a bit paranoid. So let me know below in the comments if you have the same problem I do, and if you're super worried that even if it's crispy, it's still gonna go moldy and be a total waste of time. I'm going to leave these on my kitchen bench for a few days while I head to Sydney to babysit my mum's dog, and hopefully by then they will have settled enough. I'll probably keep an eye on them for about a week on the bench to make sure there's no signs of moisture. Obviously I'm going to miss the first 2 days because I'll be in Sydney, which is why I don't really want to do any more than what I've already done. And then, all things going according to plan, I will then vacuum seal these in some jars I just need to clean out and sterilize those jars. And so they will get added to my preps, but I think this is a massive gap that I need to do a lot more of, and I'm going to go now because my dog is digging up all my tax papers. And I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.